The pink glove lay on the ground, almost completely covered now by a blanket of dead brown leaves. Around it, the sky was ablaze with a mix of pastel pinks, purples, and oranges, with a deep indigo eating away at the edges hungrily. It shortly consumed the entire sky, leaving nothing behind except black abysses between two faint stars in the dead of an autumnal night. But although the glove was hidden from view, the fact remained that it was still there, beneath the leaves, tarnished and dirty, and it was all that remained of the late Evelyn Hills. In life, Evelyn Hills had been your typical, lonely, single woman in her late 30s. She had few friends, if it could be said that she had any at all, and her only outings were out of necessity: work, groceries, and other errands. Never anything fun. She even looked, precisely, like you might imagine a lonely person would. She had hair the color of dead autumn grass, eyes a shade of blue so light they were almost colorless, and the pale skin of one who didn't venture outside to tan in the summer. She was thin and fragile looking, all skin and bones, and tended to dress in a way that was never quite flattering. Perhaps there was nothing that could have been flattering on her. Anyway, bright colors and stylish clothes had a tendency not to make her look good, but to draw away from her completely, as if she were merely a mannequin. She kept to herself, largely forgettable, and that seemed to be enough for her. Perhaps these reasons were enough to explain why the whole town of Fastwick, Minnesota was so quick to forget her. But in the dark of the night, I can't help but think that there's more to it than that. Knowing these basic things about Evelyn, imagine how surprised she was when on October 15th, the day of her 39th birthday, for which, of course, she had no real plans, she received a package in the mail. It was addressed to her, so it certainly couldn't have been a mistake. But as she stood, confusedly in her kitchen, bare feet tapping impatiently against the cool wooden floor, she could not recall ever ordering anything for herself. At least, not in a recent enough memory to justify the appearance of the package at that time. She remembered hearing horror stories on the news about innocent, unsuspecting people receiving biological weapons in the mail, and wondered to herself if perhaps she was now the target of such a scheme. Perhaps she should have been afraid, especially when her subconscious brought such frightening theories to mind. But the more she looked at the box, the modest box she could have held easily in one hand, the more curious she became. She pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, the legs making a long, scraping groan against the floor as it bored to the point of pain, and seated herself upon it, setting the box before her. At her feet, her dog, which by the way was named Mercutio. Although she seemed to lack creativity in every other aspect of her life, she spared no love or thought when it came to that small creature, looking curiously up at her from underneath the table. "It appears I've gotten a present," she explained to Mercutio, as if his inquiring brown eyes demanded an explanation. "I don't know from who." She squinted at the return address in the upper left-hand corner of the label. It didn't make the mystery any less murky. She didn't know anyone from New York, and she had not the foggiest idea how anyone from there could have gotten her address. Mercutio nosed against her knees, pressing himself against her. "Pet me," he seemed to say, and she felt a small pang of guilt for not immediately responding. "In a moment," she muttered absent-mindedly, and then she began to pry open the box. After peeling off the scotch tape on the sides, the lid opened with a small, hollow pop, and she reached cautiously in. Her blind fingers touched a smooth surface inside, a case of some sort. When she slid her fingers down the side, she felt round hinges on one and a seam on the other. She slipped her fingers around the case and pulled it out, surprised once more to find that what she held was a leather glasses case. She had never really needed glasses, had never had any reason to order them. Was this a mistake? She pried the case open to glance at the glasses within. They, like her, appeared to be nothing special. Just ordinary-looking glasses with gaudy circular frames that she remembered her own grandfather wearing. In fact, if she hadn't known any better, she would have assumed that these glasses were the very same that had perched upon her grandfather's crooked nose for many years before he died. She wondered momentarily if they had been buried with him or not, but dig as she might through her childhood memories, she couldn't quite remember. At her feet, the small dog whined, his petting having been unslightly delayed for too long now. Emerging from the murky waters of her memories, Evelyn gave a long sigh. She reached down with one hand to awkwardly scratch at the corgi's ears while she continued to examine the strange glasses in the other. The closer she looked at them, the more she saw the signs of wear and tear, and realized that they were old. The metal was dull, and the glass was covered in minute scratches that would only annoy anyone who actually needed to wear them now. And was that... Yes, she realized, straightening back up, Mercutio groaning in dismay as she pulled back her scratching hand. There was soil caked into the joints of the glasses, where one would bend them to fold them up. It was only a few granules that she was able to scratch out with her nail, but it was enough to make her wonder how the dirt had gotten there in the first place. Had they been buried at one point? Evelyn visibly recoiled at the thought, fumbling hastily with the case to store the glasses away from her sight. Once she had slipped them inside, she snapped the case shut, slapped it onto the kitchen table, and gave a relieved sigh. It was getting late. Outside her windows, the sky was going pink with a mid-fall sunset, and the light slanting through them was growing dimmer. It was only a little before 5 o'clock, but in October, the days began to shorten as Minnesota prepared itself for brutal winter. Consequently, Evelyn rose to flick on some lights in the kitchen before she bruised herself with making dinner. Mercutio also received his dinner, a cupful of kibble that she fed him in the morning and at night, and no more or less. He would eat anything that was put before him, typical of any corgi she had read, and so she had been careful to not feed the already chubby little dog too much. For herself, she steamed a mixture of veggies, feeling much too lazy to make anything that took more effort. It was still just enough to make her forget about the mysterious glasses for the time being. Later on, when she remembered them again, she would wish that she had forgotten them forever. The problem is, darkness does not like to be forgotten at all, and finds subtle, furtive ways to assert itself in our minds. Evelyn was reminded of the existence of just such a fact later that night. She had spent her evening as usual, walking her dog, showering, watching TV absent-mindedly with damp hair as she worked on a new winter scarf she was knitting for herself, and then had gone to bed promptly at 11 o'clock. She had grown set in her ways, and this was the real reason that she was always alone. her ways rarely crossed paths with others. But this didn't upset her. She woke up that night during the witching hour, glanced groggily at the alarm clock, and wondered why she had woken up at all. She had just gotten to sleep a little under an hour ago after all. She had no spouse beside her to wake her up with any assortment of nocturnal noises. There were no children in her house to crawl into bed and demand her attention, a fact she mentally rejoiced every time she saw a parent struggling with a squalling child at the local Walmart. So why was she awake? And worse yet, why was her stomach filled with a crawling, wriggling fear, as if she had just swallowed live worms? It took less than a couple of seconds for her mind to shake off the veil of sleep completely, so sharp was the needle of nervousness that pierced her brain. A thin mist of sweat beaded on her forehead and also moistened her palms. Her eyes, no longer heavy, swept around her room in search of the source of her fear. Nothing. The pale silver moonlight slanting in from her bedroom windows revealed that her room was absolutely devoid of any immediate threat. There were no psycho killers waiting in the corners, no ghosts leering down at her from the side of her bed with dead, lidless eyes. Her room was empty, except for herself. Wait, she caught herself mentally. Where was Mercutio? The corgi always slept in bed with her at night, and when she was at home during the day, he rarely left her side. It wasn't like him to get up and wander around the house at night without at least customarily waking her. And now that she thought of the dog, she actually did detect the noise that must have awakened her. A low, guttural, growling sound, unmistakably canine, that drifted to her on the wings of dead, autumnal night, originating from within her kitchen. Mercutio was by no means an aggressive sound, and Evelyn had only ever heard him growl like that once before. Hearing the sound again sent a flood of adrenaline roaring through her veins. The last time he had growled like that, hackles raised and the fur along his spine rising in a ridge, had been at a pair of glowing eyes out in the dark of the night. A pair of eyes that had, upon further inspection, belonged to a bobcat that had crept into the yard and was staring right back at the poor dog. Perhaps it was something like that once more, an animal in the yard. But even if that were the case, Evelyn didn't think she'd feel much less nervous. There was something eerie about the way the bobcat had looked up at her from beyond the windows the first time she had ever heard Mercutio growl. When its whiskered lips had wrinkled back in what must have surely been a hiss, she couldn't shake the conviction that it had actually been smirking at her. She threw back her comforter and swung her spindly legs over the edge of her bed. Immediately, the cool air rushed at her from all sides, running ethereal fingers over her skin and drawing forth goosebumps. Shivering, she wrapped her arms around herself and rose from her bed, her feet sinking into the deep, cushiony carpet of her bedroom floor almost soundlessly. With her arms still wrapped tightly around herself, she crept out of her room and down the long, dark hallway that led to her kitchen. She dreaded each step she took. Her body was trembling ever so slightly, and her voice quavered when she called for her dog. "Mercutio?" The growling did not abate. She felt the hairs on the back of her arms and neck stand on end as she unwillingly rounded the corner into her dark kitchen. Unlike what she had expected, Mercutio was not, in fact, peering through the glass of the door into the foyer. He was staring up at the kitchen table, hackles wrinkled back, fangs shining silver in the faint moonlight that trickled in, the same hate ridge of fur rising along his spine. Corgis, Evelyn knew from her personal experiences, became alarmed by anything they had never experienced before. But a table? Not only that, but the very same table that she had had for all 6 of the years she had owned Mercutio. And that's when she saw it. The glasses case, which was sitting hitherto forgotten upon the table, open once more. The silver frames were gleaming coldly in the moonlight, the glass sparkling like a pair of dead eyes staring at her through the shadows. The memories of her strange gift slammed into her like a hammer on the anvil of her mind, and she suddenly remembered that she had closed the case before. Mercutio was a smart dog, but she doubted he had the capability to open a glasses case without chewing through it, and more than that, she doubted he would have had the patience to figure out a way to get onto her table in the first place. She was struck by the sudden realization that her dog wasn't actually snarling at the table. No. His dark brown eyes, usually soft with gooey kindness, were now locked hatefully upon that very same pair of glasses which had drawn her eye. She wanted to laugh out loud at the idea of a dog being afraid of a pair of glasses, but the sound that actually came from her was a mad, joyous cackle. Something about the glasses was absolutely mesmerizing, and it horrified her. When there had still been sunlight left in the sky to chase away the shadows of nightmares, it had been easy to banish the freakish notion that these were the very same spectacles her grandfather had, and this she remembered all of a sudden with clarity, actually been buried in. But now, as the shadows flickered silently around her, and the moon gazed in through her windows like a lidless eye, she believed what would have seemed foolish before. Murmuring what she imagined were comforting sounds to her dog, she stole forward, moving between him and the table. Slowly, like in a dream, her hand fluttered out and settled upon the glasses. The frames pressed into the palm of her hand like cold wires. As if she were flicking off a switch, Mercutio's thunderous growling ceased the moment she picked them up. Instead, an even more ominous sound drifted upward from her dog. Whimpering. She whirled around to face him, glasses still in hand. He had gone from outraged to terrified. His ears were now lying flat on the top of his head, and his fur was bristling out in every direction. Now, his eyes were fixed upon what she held against her chest. Her dead grandfather's glasses. The jagged, maniacal laugh that had tumbled from her before made another appearance. Following some impulse she couldn't understand, as if her body were no longer hers to command, she unfolded the glasses and put them onto her nose.
See? They're fine. There's nothing wrong.
She started to say amidst mad giggles, but her throat froze. Her laughter trailed off into a choking sound. The world as she knew it was gone. As she gazed through the scratchy lenses, the moon-splashed world that she had seen only moments before had been replaced by a hellish, darkling travesty. The changes were nothing more than additions over a familiar framework. She could still see her kitchen if she really tried, but these new additions were too horrifying to concentrate. From every patch of shadow, no matter how small, arose vague, black forms of every shape and size, as if each patch of darkness were in fact a doorway into hell. Some of these forms had eyes, glowing, blinking, shifting, watchful eyes staring out from the blackness. Others had mouths that leered crookedly, teeth gleaming beneath thin veneers of toxic saliva. And Evelyn, poor Evelyn, knew instantly that she was not dreaming. Her mouth worked soundlessly as she searched for her voice, her skin prickling beneath the dozens of stares that had honed in on her. She backed hard against her table with a hollow thunk noise. Behind her, her hands scrabbled at its wooden surface as if she were going to climb backwards. Her fingers found a scrap of paper that had come with her package, a note she had not noticed before, and sent the letter fluttering to the floor, where it was quickly lost in the ravenous dark. It would have offered her little enough explanation. I rather think it would have alarmed her to have read the elegant script that had swept across the page. It is the lonely who know most well the faces of the shadows, and it is the lonely who are consumed by this very same darkness. This epithet would not have calmed Evelyn. Nothing could have at that point in time. When her mind, hazed with horror, finally realized that she could not proceed any further backwards, she chose a new path. She jolted forward, hands searching through the murky light for her beloved dog, and found his warm and comforting form. She tried to lace her fingers around him, to pull him against her chest as she ran, but Mercutio backed away from her with a startled yelp and whimper. He wouldn't come near her while she wore the glasses, which she had forgotten were even on her face. Desperately, she cried for him, scrambling forwards, her hands searching through the writhing forms which were all reaching for her now. Some were actually able to touch her. She could feel her flannel pajamas being pulled this way and that way, could hear the tears of claws rip through the fabric, could feel the warmth of blood welling out from freshly opened scratches on her body. One grabbed a fold of her hair and began to pull almost lovingly. She gave a hopeless, tearful cry. She couldn't get to her dog. He kept scampering just out of reach, and she didn't have the strength to remain inside her house of horrors anymore. Even as she watched, Mercutio disappeared into a horde of writhing arms and legs, as if he couldn't see the monsters there, and from the tangled mess of blackness, a sharp, pained keening began to arise. They were hurting him, her poor, sweet dog, and she didn't have the courage to do anything about it. Her eyes began to waver with hot tears. She cried not for the burning of the many scratches being torn into her flesh, but for the pain in her heart, the admission of her own cowardice. With a sob, she tore herself free from the grasping, inky claws that held her. Some of her hair ripped from her scalp in the process, and bolted along the thin aisle of moonlight that lay upon her kitchen floor. It was a short distance to her foyer, but she couldn't get there fast enough. All she could think of was getting out. What came after didn't matter. She jammed her feet into some tennis shoes, jerked on a jacket, and thrust her hands into some pink gloves she had knit for herself, all the while sobbing. She dodged yet more groping hands as she yanked open the door. They were laughing. She could hear them laughing now. A low, guttural sound that she could feel vibrating against the soles of her shoes, and amidst the laughing was their whispering. Yes, she realized. They were whispering horrible, disgusting things about what they would do when they caught her. Peel the flesh off your body in strips. Tear your beating heart out of your chest. Feed you pieces of your dog. It's still screaming. Whimpering, she clapped her woolly mittens over her ears and exploded out of the front door. The frigid night air slammed into her as if she had run into a wall of ice. It was cold enough that her breath burst from her lips in frantic white clouds that immediately dissipated into the night sky above. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but she wasn't safe outside either. The horror had spread beyond the boundaries of her home. In her yard, unnameable monstrosities sprung up from every shadow. There were black demons cavorting beneath the skeletal shadows of bare tree branches. There were ebony monsters leering at her from around the corner of her house, which was cast into shadow. There were countless, unblinking eyes watching her from the darkness of the forest which encroached on three sides of her yard. Grotesque and misshapen paws kept reaching out towards her from in between the trees, but extended no farther than the line of shadows. In fact, none of them seemed to be capable of leaving the shadows. The realization made her laugh in relief. She just needed to keep in the moonlight, and she would be fine. Meanwhile, she would make her way over to her neighbor's house, the nearest one being half a mile away, and call the police from there. She didn't even pause to reflect on just how ludicrous her story would sound to the authorities. That didn't matter. For once in her life, she just wanted to be near another human being and know that help was on the way. Still laughing somewhat madly to herself, she began to jog up her own driveway, careful to avoid the shadows of the trees that lined either side of it. She cursed at herself for purchasing such a private house now, for the going would be long and difficult. She thought of an old rhyme she used to chant in childhood whenever she walked on a sidewalk as a child. Step on a crack, break your mother's back. Except now it was more along the lines of step in the dark, and monsters will eat your heart. Tears were still running down her face, now numb with the cold, but she laughed once more at the rhyme she had just made. If the truth were to be told, she had gone more than a little mad with grief at the inevitable death of poor Mercutio. But of course, things were not destined to get any better for Evelyn Hills, if you can recall. Just as she neared the end of her driveway, where she would have been in clear view of the road, the public road, a shadow drifted over the eye that was the moon, like a gauzy, gray eyelid. The entire world fell under the pall of shadow. Suddenly, claws, legs, head, torsos, eyes, and gleaming teeth filled the world, and Evelyn was seemingly alone among them. That was, of course, also the precise moment that her foot plunged into an unexpected hole in her driveway, and she was sent spiraling on her hands and knees in the dirt. Her glasses, the corpse glasses, were catapulted from her nose by the force of the fall. Clinking against pebbles, they skittered away from her grasp in a shower of broken glass. The shadow monsters that had been drawing nearer were abruptly erased from existence. Blinking confusedly, she looked around her, torn between relief and an even higher level of terror. Were they really gone? Had this all just been some horrible nightmare? after all. It had to be, she thought. There's no way she could have brought herself to just abandon her dog if she had been awake. She must have been sleepwalking down her driveway and the fall had woken her up out of it. But just as she began to mull over what she could have possibly eaten that would have caused such strange nocturnal behavior, a severed paw dropped seemingly from nowhere and dropped wetly onto the ground before her. Her heart shot upwards into her throat. She recognized that small, white paw. She didn't have time to begin screaming as she felt something tugging on her clothes. No, she felt some things tugging on her clothes. As there was surely more than one source, coming from all directions at once. She felt a harsh, invisible hand grab at her hair and jerk her head back. The nothingness of a cloudy night sky was the last thing Evelyn Hills saw as her body was torn steadily to pieces, just out of sight of the road. The mysterious disappearance of the late Evelyn Hills did not make any real disturbance in the sleepy town of Faswick, as perhaps the death of another would. After enough time, she was presumed dead by the authorities, and once the legalities had been finished, her small, private house was put up for sale once again. She was gone, and if you were to ask anyone about her, even people who were supposed to know her, such as her co-workers, their eyes would glaze over. Staring off into the distance, they would give you a vague answer. Something like, "Oh, she lived here once. She's gone now." Humanity has its own primal defenses against the dark. When we encounter the mysterious or the inexplicable, all too often, we avert our eyes and forget that it ever happened. Just like we forgot the late Evelyn Hills.